Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. Perhaps no animal is more central to the Alamo story than the horse. Couriers on horseback brought word Santa Anna's army was approaching San Antonio and spread the grim news throughout Texas that the situation at the Alamo went from dire to deadly. Today we reveal how the horses of the Texas Revolution got to the Lone Star State, what we've learned from old newspaper ads about how they were used, and the artifacts on display right now at the Alamo to tell their story. I'm your host, Emily Baucom. We're joined by Kolby Lanham, the Alamo's senior researcher and historian. Thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm always excited to come back here and talk to the listeners and talk about new topics. It's exciting.
And this is a really cool topic. Let's start with the importance of horses in the 1830s. Just as today, we value cars for getting us around, horses were pretty much the only means of transportation.
Yeah, unless you were walking using your 2 feet, you were either being pulled in a wagon by a horse or you were riding a horse. There were also mules being used and sometimes donkeys, but horses were the preferred mode of transportation.
There's this romance surrounding the horse in the American Southwest, and it really stems from this time period.
It stems from this period. It also goes back a little bit further in American history where the horse was a status symbol. It meant you had power and standing within the community. It meant you had some wealth. And then when you move into the American Southwest, the horse becomes this access to unparalleled mobility. You could go further, you could go faster, and it allowed us to expand westward. It was really important.
Besides transportation, what were they used for?
They used horses for a lot of things. They used them for agriculture. They used them for warfare. The importance of that animal cannot be understated. It was used daily, and we relied upon it heavily in Texas. So Stephen F. Austin, many consider him to be the father of Texas. He writes on March 5th of 1836 that it's important that we maintain relations with Spain and that we can open up some kind of communication with Cuba, Spanish Cuba. And why? It's because he knew they had tons of horses. They had horses, they had oxen, they had beef. And so he knew that by opening up communication with them, that we could get access to that stuff for the revolution, and it would benefit Texas greatly.
This is the day before the Battle of the Alamo.
Yeah, so before the battle, he's thinking about this in the long term. He's thinking about Texas as a whole and what's going to happen after the revolution's complete. The other part of that is that he looks at how horses are being used in Texas, and he realizes that there probably needs to be some rules to that. So he makes several different ordinances, and one of them was to not let horses run wild. You can't let your horse run throughout San Felipe de Austin in this case. They were having issues with male horses who were not castrated, mating with other horses, and that could be a bad thing. If you had a really fine horse and it ends up impregnating another horse, it could be an issue. So he makes laws governing that, and there's actually fines associated with letting your horse run wild in San Felipe de Austin, which I thought was pretty interesting. Austin makes several different ordinances to concern horses in general, and he's trying to lay down some groundwork for what we would use later on in the American West.
We also know horses were used for recreation and entertainment, and you have tracked that through newspaper ads.
I think this is one of the most interesting things I found in my research with horses is the early newspapers and the fact that in the 1830s, they're racing horses in Texas, and that comes from the American East Coast. They're racing them there, they're racing them in England, and so when they come to Texas, the races don't stop. And through my research, I found a lot of really neat articles, but one of them was from Columbia, Texas on October 4th, 1834, and there was going to be a large race between two horses, one named Rocket and one named Snap, and they had wagered $500 for that race, which is equivalent to almost 20 grand in today's money. I couldn't find who won that race, but I'm thinking it was probably Rocket because
those are great names.
Yeah, not a bad name for a horse, especially if he's a fast one. I'm thinking it might have been Rocket because not long after that, the owner puts another newspaper article out and says that they're going to race Rocket versus another horse called the Gambler. And they wager $1,000, which is close to $37,000 in today's money. That's a lot of cash to bet on a horse. As I'm looking through, I found some really cool names that I think the listeners might find interesting. One of them was Miss LaBelle. Another one was the Conqueror. Another is Havoc. And then one in particular was named Bel Air. And he was owned by David Hamilton, who was part of Austin's Old 300. He's described as a beautiful chestnut sorrel, and he was 15 and a half hands. Apparently, he was a descendant of a very famous horse called Janus, or Janus, as I see it pronounced different ways. That horse is coming from England, and he is a mix of an Arabian horse and an English horse. He kind of becomes the predecessor for a lot of the American quarter horses, which we'll talk about later in the podcast.
That's so cool. And there's an ongoing scientific discussion about whether horses were here all along or if they were reintroduced here by European explorers.
Yeah, this is pretty fascinating, and it led me down several rabbit holes. By no means am I an expert on taxonomy and the archaeological record when it concerns ancient horses, but I do know a little bit more than I did before I started my research. This is kind of a discussion where the history field and the scientific field collide, and they're not exactly getting along. I think it's going to broach some interesting conversations down the road as to how we could use historical research and data in the field that we're working in as historians and all the plethora of information we have to tie in with the scientific data that archaeologists are using. It's so important that we use modern technology and mix it with the past. But where it kind of lands at the moment, historians are saying that the colonial Spanish horses, what we commonly refer to as Spanish Mustangs, were brought to the New World. They were domesticated around 6,000 years ago, and they come to Texas in 1519. The standing idea on the historian side is that during the Pueblo Revolt in 1680s, roughly 1,000 horses got loose, and some of the tribes gathered those horses, they domesticated them further, and then used them and learned how to ride those horses, and then they master the horse. There's no doubt about that. Well, science is coming in. They're seeing it from a different angle, and it kind of starts with a horse called the Lehigh horse, which was found in Utah, and it suggests that the Indian tribes like the Ute and the Shoshone may have had the horse before 1680. And they're looking at the remains of this animal that was found previously had been misdated according to their research. They used radiocarbon dating, and it puts the date a little bit earlier than 1680, saying that these tribes had always had the horse and that they were domesticated before Spain ever came into the play. There are drawbacks to both sides of the argument. The historian side is only using the Spanish record, and because most tribes did not leave behind a written record, we have to just go with what the Spanish are saying and take that as fact. And that was the case for many, many years. But now we have science stepping in, and science is giving us the other side. There are also tribal members from the Utes and the Shoshone who have stepped in and said, we've always had these oral histories regarding the horse. And so this is going back and forth. I read the formal report on the Lehigh horse, and it was pretty interesting. And the end result is they're saying they don't exactly know for sure. There are some issues. They're using radiocarbon dating, which fluctuates dates. And if we're only talking about a short, 20-year span, we could be off the mark. And the other part of that is that the cranium of this horse was obliterated, was not in pieces where they could actually look at the denture and the teeth of the animal and decide whether or not he had any buildup in his mouth from where an iron bit would have sat from that rigorous and rough riding. And so because they couldn't look at that, they only could, look at what they have. And so I think the debate is still out there, but some people might find that frustrating, but I think it's great because it takes these two disciplines and it causes us to work together, and maybe we can discover more information as it moves forward.
That's a great point. The Alamo has a number of equestrian artifacts in its collection that help us track the changes over time and how horses were used. Let's start with what Spain brought over when it controlled Mexico. Those items are really more of a conquistador look. Were they considered antique at the time?
Yeah, I think what happens mainly here with our story is that when the conquistadors show up, they're using some modern technology that had been tested on the battlefields of Europe, where standing armies were matching each other's technology. As one advanced, so did the other. And when they take that technology and they come to the New World, they find that they're taking a step back in time. They're having to fight people who are still using bows and arrows and clubs, but also rocks and slings. And so they go back into their inventories and start pulling out older weapons, and they're using them to great effect. But the horse is the key to all of that. The Spanish were able to best some of the larger indigenous tribes on the field of battle simply because of the horse. And they're also using medieval armor, which we have some in our collection, which hopefully will be displayed soon.
We did show some of it in November at the Weapons and Whiskey event we held in partnership with Bohannon's. Describe what people saw that night.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we did show some of that stuff off at the Weapons and Whiskey. We had a horse, what's called a chamfrom, that went over the front of the horse's face to guard it from sling bolts or maybe arrows. We also had some stirrups. We had a number of other spurs and things of that nature that would have been used by conquistadors in early Texas. We brought that on in our collection. It kind of changed our collection in a really great way. It filled a gap.
It's a lot of chainmail type of looking things. I don't know a better way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way of putting it. It makes you think of medieval Europe. It really does. And I would say it would probably be antique during that time period in Spain and Europe. But here in the American Southwest, it was at home. And it lasts for quite some time, and then it's slowly abandoned for lighter gear.
How did horses help Spain conquer more and more territory?
Well, firstly, they're used in the military, and they're used very effectively. And that's one of the reasons why Spain wanted to keep the horse out of the hands of the indigenous tribes of the American Southwest. They didn't want them to be playing on equal footing. And so if what the historical record is true, in 1680, when several tribes get a hold of Spanish horses, that levels the playing field drastically. So that's one way that the Spanish are using that to conquer this area. The other way is that they're using it for agricultural means. So that puts food in the bellies of missionaries here in San Antonio and other places. They're using it to travel, which is really important. You can travel quicker. You can get messages sent throughout the state faster. Particularly in the mission system, they're teaching the indigenous peoples of the missions how to tend cattle on horseback. And that's a really big deal. It helps, it's having to do it all on foot. You're using a horse. The first cowboys are coming from the missions, and they are a mix of native individuals who are going through a conversion process in the mission system, but also some that are Spanish and native born. They're a mix, or what we call mestizo. And then there's also African cowboys in Texas. And so the Spanish are going to be using the horse to teach them how to tend cattle.
Our conversation continues after this message.
This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Welcome back to the Alamo Podcast. The Donald and Louisiana Spanish Colonial Collection includes many ranching items. A lot of those are on display in the Alamo exhibit. How do these items show the evolution of how horses were used?
Yeah, if you go through the Yenna collection of stuff that's both on display and going to be on display in the new Visitor Center Museum, you'll see an evolution of horse tack. The bits become less intense. Some of them look very crude and very painful. And you'll see kind of this morphology into the more modern bit. Same with the stirrups. We have several pairs of cruciform stirrups in our collection, which when you look at that, they're very heavy, they're very large, and that's a burden for the horse. Every ounce of gear you end up putting on, or pound of gear you end up putting on the horse, is going to be harder for the horse to move. And so as you go through it, you see the stirrups changing, and then we get into more of a modern feel, and the Yenna collection helps to explain that.
The horses that were in Texas at the time of the Revolution, where did they come from?
The horses that are coming here to Texas, they're coming with colonists that are coming from the United States. They're bringing over those English horses that have been brought in early on in our nation's history. And then those horses are going to mix in with Spanish, what we call Spanish Mustangs. And then they'll also be mixed in with some of the horses from the Mexican Army. And you're going to get this admixture of horses. And so that's where we get the ones we're using for the Revolution. So what Texas ends up with is these wild herds of animals. They're roaming around, and these Mustangs, as they're now called, are being rounded up. And they're being rounded up, in particular, one story is about a man named Philip Nolan, who's coming in from Spanish Louisiana. He's coming into Texas. Initially, the Spanish government in Texas is kind of welcoming of Nolan, but eventually they get a little bit suspicious of what he's doing, and they don't really trust him. But he makes 3 significant trips. The first one will be around 1791. He'll bring 50 horses to Louisiana. By 1794, he brings 250 horses. And then by 1797, he brings 1,600 horses into Louisiana. Wow. A lot of animals. But by the year 1800, he comes to Texas illegally. He's been told not to come back. He comes back anyways. There's rumors spreading that he's going to try to start kind of a filibuster expedition and try to take over Texas. And the Spanish government's not having it. In 1801, they surround him with about 120 men, and they kill Philip Nolan. They chop off his ears, and they send them to the viceroy to show that they'd captured and killed him. So it doesn't end well for Philip Nolan, but those horses from Texas are spread throughout the American South, and they still have descendants in the American South today.
Circling back to our story here at the Alamo, because people used paper IOUs to buy horses, today we are able to track the movements of the Alamo defenders through those documents. What can you learn from them?
The IOUs are a glimpse into the past. They help us understand how the economy worked in Texas. It also helps us understand that there wasn't a lot of money floating around. And so if you needed a horse, you could write an IOU. And Stephen F. Austin addresses that in one of his general orders. He talks about using IOUs to buy or procure animals for the Texican revolutionary cause. These IOUs are spread throughout. They're signed by people like William Barrett Travis, James Bowie, and many others. And then that IOU was held on to. Now, if the revolution didn't go our way, then they're useless and you lost your animal and it was probably killed in service, then you're out the money. You're holding on to that IOU, hoping that we're successful. And in this case, of course, we were. And some of those IOUs are paid, maybe within like a 10-year period after the revolution.
The first document Phil Collins collected was from a courier.
That's correct. Couriers are extremely important in the Alamo story with carrying the news of the events throughout the revolution throughout Texas. That IOU was for a horse and a saddle. And a really important part of our story.
There were people on horseback bringing news that Santa Anna's troops were approaching San Antonio.
Yeah, you think about that and how fast when I say how fast, it's a lot faster than on foot. If you were on foot, that news wouldn't spread very quick. And I think of like Paul Revere's ride whenever I think about these men spreading this news, because Paul Revere didn't even own a horse. He had to borrow that horse to run that famous ride he did. And so these men on horseback are bringing the news of Santana's approach, and it's extremely important to the preparation of San Antonio and of course, the preparation of the men inside the Alamo.
There's that story that the lookouts, if they saw the horses kind of ambling back, they were safe. But if they saw them running back, that meant the Mexican army was approaching San Antonio.
Right. That's right. And, there's kind of this prevailing myth that the Texans inside the Alamo and San Antonio are caught off guard, but in reality, they had scouts and they knew the Mexican army was coming.
What role did couriers play in bringing news from the Alamo during the siege and then in the wake of the battle?
Yeah, so those couriers are carrying out dispatches written by Colonel Travis and others to try and garner support for the revolution in whole, but to try to get men inside the Alamo. And 32 men from the town of Gonzales do show up. And it's because of those couriers carrying those dispatches, men like James Butler Bonham and others. It helps the Alamo cause. But after the Alamo falls, there's another prevailing myth that's they were gathering time for Sam Houston to build his army. But when the Alamo falls, Sam Houston has next to nobody with him. And so because of the horse and the men on that horse, they're spreading the news quickly, and it garners support for the revolution, and men pick up their firearms and they join the Texian cause.
You could say Sam Houston rode a horse of a different color during the sweeping victory at San Jacinto. What was remarkable about this horse?
So this is a really interesting, I keep using the word myth, but there's a lot of that, that's kind of sprinkled throughout the Alamo story and the Texas story. When you look at the paintings that show Sam Houston from the Battle of San Jacinto, he's on this giant white charger, and he just looks really majestic, But in actuality, as we dug through the record, and other people have done a lot of this legwork, we find that the horse was actually gray. His name was Saracen. He's purchased just a handful of, not very long before the Battle of San Jacinto, and unfortunately the horse is killed. And Sam Houston ends up riding 3 different horses during that battle. That horse was not white, as we'd like to imagine him, being on. It was actually a gray horse.
But there is that imagery, and horses go hand in hand with the imagery of the revolution.
They're absolutely tied hand in hand.
For people who are really interested in this topic, you've actually been reading a book from 1966, and if people can track it down, you recommend it.
I think it's a really interesting glimpse into the early Texas and the horses, and then the evolution of the American quarter horse. It's called Fine Texas Horses, Their Pedigrees and Performance, 1830 to 1845 by Malcolm McLean. It's really worth the read, and it's super interesting.
I found some copies on Amazon and on eBay. Fair warning to our listeners, there's low supply of this book, so it's going to cost you. The dollar amounts I saw were about $50-$60.
Yeah, it's kind of pricey, but in my opinion, if you're serious about Texas history, it should be in your library.
There is an enduring legacy of the horse in Texas, of cowboys and ranching culture, and it really begins during this frontier period.
You kind of mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, about how the car took over where the horse left off. And what I think is so fascinating about that, you're absolutely right? We've replaced the horse in modern transportation, but why is it such an enduring legacy? Because the car is an inanimate object and the horse is something that we can fall in love with. Animals, and particularly the horse, they're very intelligent. And so we bond with those animals. And I think that's why part of that legacy kind of lives on, but also the freedom that the horse brought people. And it just becomes part of the American spirit.
You see it in the old movies like John Wayne's The Alamo.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the horse was your best friend in some cases and carried you out of a tight spot. You would never forget that. And so this love affair between man and horse really kind of spurs during that period.
Spurs, I see what you did there. And this extends to modern day. Whenever we have a horse in Alamo Plaza, crowds descend. Just a few days ago, the Bexar County Sheriff's Office brought its mounted patrol by, and there were so many people taking photos during this surprise visit. People just want to see a horse at the Alamo.
I really think that it's so interesting to me to watch it happen. You know, I think that there's as much excitement about a horse being in Alamo Plaza as when we bring the camels to visit. And so when horses show up, it's like they've never seen a horse before. And I think it's just a really cool symbolic moment. Like when the Clydesdales came, the Budweiser Clydesdales. I mean, that crowd gathered for almost 2 hours to wait to see those horses.
That was right before Fiesta last year.
Yeah, to watch the horses just hitch up and walk,
And we do have some cowboy-themed events coming up. On February 1st, we have our annual Rodeo Roundup. It's a living history event. And then we are kicking off the Alamo Livestock Roundup, harnessing the ranching community in Texas to raise money for the Alamo plan. Because, Kolby, cowboys, horses, the Alamo, nothing says Texas like those things.
Yeah, I don't think that we've ever had a more Texas fundraiser than this one. It's very exciting. And if you go onto our website, you can see that everyone has a chance to participate. We're going to have a lot of opportunities, but this is getting part of the Texian soul involved in our fundraising, getting animals and horses and other livestock brought into the fold. And hopefully we can raise money through the event.
And an extra incentive to go at Saddle Up on March 29th, the party to kick off this fundraising initiative. There's going to be a special treat inside the Alamo Church. You mentioned earlier a collection we've brought in that really hasn't been on display yet. There are some antique saddles that are a part of it, and they're going to be on display.
We have worked really hard to try to bring in saddles. We had a collection that numbered around 4,000 artifacts. And I think we had about 3 pack saddles, and that was it. And so we had a huge gap in that collection. And within the past year, we brought in, I think, close to 20 or 30 saddles. We're going to have about 10 of them on display. They're very fine pieces. One of them is handmade and hand-tooled in San Antonio, probably from around the 1870s. And then we have some early indigenous saddles as well. And then we'll have some of the horse tack from bits and spurs and other pieces on display as well.
Kolby Lanham, thank you so much for joining us.
As always, thanks for having me.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. Next week's episode will be all about the Alamo Livestock Roundup, but if all this horse talk has piqued your interest, we have a link to a few ways you can get involved in the effort, including how to attend Saddle Up on March 29th. Plus, we've linked to everything you need to know to attend Rodeo Roundup at the Alamo, a living history event. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.